"You don't sit there," the officer said, his voice sharp enough to cut through the quiet courtroom before anyone even realized what was happening. And the sound of his words seemed louder than the ticking wall clock above the judge's bench as every head slowly turned toward the woman standing near the front row. Dressed in a simple navy blazer, dark jeans, and low heels. Nothing flashy, nothing expensive, nothing that signaled authority. And yet she stood with a calm that didn't match the tension forming around her. Danielle Carter didn't move. She simply looked at the officer as if she had heard those words before, as if this wasn't the first time someone decided she didn't belong in a place she had every right to be. Officer Mark Reynolds stepped closer, his badge catching the overhead fluorescent light. "This area is restricted," he added, gesturing toward the polished wooden rail separating the public seating from the legal floor. A few spectators leaned forward, sensing something unfolding. Danielle glanced briefly at the courtroom, the American flag hanging behind the empty judge's seat, the quiet murmur of attorneys organizing their papers, the faint smell of coffee drifting from a styrofoam cup near the clerk's desk. She spoke calmly. "I'm exactly where I need to be." Her tone wasn't confrontational. It wasn't defensive. It was measured, steady. The kind of voice that didn't need volume to command attention. Officer Reynolds frowned, clearly annoyed by her composure. "Ma'am, I'm going to ask you again. Step back and take a seat," he said, louder this time. A bailiff near the door shifted his weight. Watching closely, Danielle still didn't move. She simply folded her hands lightly in front of her. The silence stretched, heavy and uncomfortable, like a pause before thunder. A few people exchanged glances, unsure why the moment felt so charged. Then Officer Reynolds exhaled sharply. As if patience had run out, he reached toward the papers in Danielle's hand and motioned downward dismissively. "You're not part of this proceeding," he muttered, his tone edged with irritation. The gesture caused the documents to slip slightly, and for a second the room froze. Not because of what happened, but because of how Danielle reacted. She didn't flinch, didn't protest, didn't raise her voice. She simply bent slightly, gathered the papers with deliberate calm, and straightened again. Her composure seemed to shift the atmosphere. The clerk, Emily Foster, glanced up from her computer, her fingers hovering above the keyboard. Something about the name printed on the top page caught her attention. She leaned slightly, trying to read it again, but before she could speak, Officer Reynolds shook his head and stepped aside. "Just sit down," he said, dismissively. Danielle looked toward the empty judge's bench, then back at the officer, her expression unreadable. The courtroom clock ticked once, twice, 3 times, somewhere in the back row. A man whispered to his wife. "What's going on?" She shrugged, eyes fixed on Danielle. The bailiff near the door straightened his jacket. The attorneys paused their quiet conversations, and Danielle Carter took one small step forward. Not rushed, not hesitant, just deliberate. Like someone who understood exactly how the next few seconds would change everything. And in that moment, the quiet courtroom no longer felt routine. It felt like something was about to shift, something no one in that room had prepared for. And Danielle stood there, calm, composed, waiting, as if she already knew the courtroom wasn't about to start without her. Danielle Carter remained standing near the front rail as the low murmur inside the courtroom slowly returned. But the energy had shifted. The quiet no longer felt routine. It felt observant, as if every person in the room was waiting for something they could not yet define. Officer Mark Reynolds stepped back half a pace, clearly expecting her to comply, but Danielle did not move toward the public seating. She simply adjusted the documents in her hand and glanced briefly toward the clerk's desk. Emily Foster continued staring at her screen, then back at Danielle, then again at the screen, her expression tightening as if she had recognized something but was not yet certain. The bailiff near the doorway, Tom Bradley, folded his arms and watched carefully, his posture casual but his eyes alert. Danielle took another measured step forward, her heels making a soft sound against the polished wood floor, and that sound alone seemed to draw even more attention. A lawyer near the front table paused mid-sentence. Another shifted his legal pad slightly, and somewhere in the back row a phone vibrated quietly before being silenced. The clock above the judge's bench ticked again, steady and indifferent. Danielle looked briefly toward the empty chair behind the bench, then back toward the clerk, her calm presence beginning to feel less like hesitation and more like intention. Officer Reynolds exhaled sharply. "Ma'am, I already told you. You need to step back," he said, though his tone now carried less certainty than before. Danielle turned her head slowly toward him, her expression neutral, almost thoughtful. "The session has not started yet," she said calmly, her voice low but clear enough for the front rows to hear. The statement seemed simple, but it caused Emily Foster to look up again. This time more quickly, she leaned forward slightly and tapped a few keys, her eyes scanning the docket displayed on her monitor. The bailiff shifted his stance again, glancing briefly toward Emily, as if sensing the same unease. Danielle's posture remained steady, shoulders relaxed, hands loosely holding the papers. There was no sign of frustration, no urgency, only patience. The kind that suggested she was accustomed to waiting for others to catch up. Officer Reynolds glanced toward the clerk, then back to Danielle, clearly uncertain why the tension in the room had grown. "Just take a seat," he repeated, softer now. Danielle did not answer immediately. She looked across the courtroom once more, the rows of benches, the attorneys, the quiet anticipation, and then she took another step forward, stopping just short of the bench. The movement was small but deliberate. Emily Foster's fingers paused above her keyboard. She leaned closer to her screen again, reading the name at the top of the docket. Then she glanced back at Danielle, her eyes widening slightly, as if something had just aligned, but she hesitated, unsure whether to speak. Tom Bradley noticed the shift and followed her gaze, then looked back at Danielle, his expression tightening. The room felt still again. Even the faint hum of the overhead lights seemed louder. Danielle Carter remained calm, composed, standing at the front of the courtroom as if she had always belonged there, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, the balance of authority in the room began to tilt. Emily Foster finally leaned closer to her screen, her eyes narrowing as she reread the docket. Then she glanced back at Danielle Carter again, this time longer, more carefully, as if comparing memory with reality. The quiet tension in the courtroom stretched thin. Tom Bradley noticed the hesitation and stepped toward the clerk's desk, lowering his voice. "Everything okay?" he asked. Emily did not answer immediately. Her fingers hovered above the keyboard. She scrolled slightly, then stopped again. The name at the top of the schedule remained unchanged, Danielle Carter. She swallowed quietly. Her eyes flicked once more toward Danielle standing calmly near the bench. Officer Mark Reynolds shifted his weight, clearly impatient. "We are about to start," he muttered, glancing toward the hallway behind the bench, but the door remained closed. Danielle did not react to his tone. She simply placed her documents gently on the edge of the bench, her movements precise, deliberate, the kind of calm that did not belong to someone uncertain. A lawyer seated at the prosecution table leaned toward his colleague and whispered, "Who is she?" The colleague shook his head slightly, still watching. The spectators in the back rows leaned forward, sensing the moment thickening. Emily finally cleared her throat softly. "Tom," she said quietly, but the single word carried enough weight to draw his attention immediately. He stepped closer. Emily turned her monitor slightly toward him, her finger pointing at the docket line. Tom's expression changed subtly, his brows tightening as he read. He looked up at Danielle, then back at the screen, then again at Danielle. The shift in his posture was small but noticeable. Officer Reynolds noticed the exchange and stepped forward. "Is there a problem?" he asked. Tom did not answer right away. He seemed to measure the room, then glanced toward the hallway behind the bench, still closed. Danielle remained still, her presence steady, almost patient, as if she expected this moment to unfold exactly this way. Emily whispered again, "That is today's assignment." Tom nodded slowly, his eyes returning to Danielle Carter. Something in the air changed again, quieter but heavier. Officer Reynolds frowned, sensing the hesitation. "She needs to step back," he repeated. Though his voice lacked the firmness from earlier, Tom exhaled slowly, then straightened his jacket, his attention now fully on Danielle. "Ma'am," he said carefully, his tone noticeably more measured than before. Danielle turned slightly toward him, her expression calm, neutral. Tom hesitated, as if reconsidering his next words, then glanced again at Emily. She gave a subtle nod. The clock ticked again above them. Danielle Carter stood at the front of the courtroom, composed, unhurried. The attorneys had stopped whispering now. Even the spectators sensed the shift. Officer Reynolds looked between Tom and Danielle, confusion growing across his face. Tom stepped half a pace forward, not confrontational, not dismissive, simply attentive. Danielle met his gaze calmly, and in that moment, the authority that had filled the room minutes earlier began to soften. Uncertainty replacing confidence. The closed door behind the bench remained still, but the room no longer felt like it was waiting for the judge. It felt like it was waiting for Danielle Carter. Tom Bradley's voice softened as he addressed Danielle Carter again. "Ma'am, may I ask your name?" The question sounded formal now, careful, as if the answer mattered more than he expected. Danielle looked at him steadily. "Danielle Carter," she replied, her tone even, unhurried. Emily Foster's fingers tightened slightly on the edge of the desk as she heard the confirmation. She glanced again at the docket, then back at Danielle, the subtle tension in her posture growing more obvious. "Officer." Mark Reynolds frowned, clearly confused by the shift in tone. "Tom, we do not need to ask her anything. She just needs to step back," he said. Though his voice lacked the authority it had earlier, Tom did not respond immediately. Instead, he glanced again at Emily. She gave another small nod, the kind that carried more meaning than words. The attorneys at the front table had completely stopped preparing their notes now. One of them leaned back slightly, observing. The spectators in the back rows leaned forward, sensing something unfolding that no one had expected. Danielle remained calm, her hands resting lightly near the documents she had placed on the bench, her composure unbroken. Officer Reynolds shifted again, impatience returning. "The judge will be here any minute," he said, glancing toward the closed door behind the bench. But the words sounded uncertain now, as if he was trying to convince himself more than anyone else. Emily cleared her throat again, louder this time. "Tom," she said, her voice careful but firm. He stepped closer. She turned her monitor slightly again, this time more deliberately. Tom read silently, his expression tightening. Then he looked up toward Danielle, his posture changing. The room seemed to sense the shift instantly. The faint hum of the overhead lights felt louder again. Officer Reynolds noticed and stepped closer. "What is going on?" he asked, his tone edged with frustration. Tom hesitated, then spoke quietly. "Just give me a moment." Danielle watched the exchange calmly, her expression unchanged. A lawyer near the defense table whispered, "This is unusual." His colleague nodded without taking his eyes off the front of the courtroom. The clock ticked again, the second hand sweeping forward with quiet precision. Tom straightened slowly, his attention returning fully to Danielle Carter. "Ma'am," he said again, more respectfully now. Danielle met his gaze, still composed. Emily Foster sat upright behind the desk, ready, as if anticipating what might happen next. Officer Reynolds crossed his arms, confusion turning into discomfort. The balance of control in the room had shifted again, subtle but undeniable. Danielle Carter stood at the front of the courtroom, calm, steady, and as the quiet stretched across the room, it became clear to everyone watching that the situation was no longer routine. Something larger was unfolding, and no one in that courtroom could stop watching Danielle Carter. Officer Mark Reynolds shifted forward again, his discomfort now visible in the tight set of his shoulders. The uncertainty in the room seemed to irritate him more than anything else. He glanced at Tom Bradley, then at Danielle Carter, and finally back toward the closed door behind the bench, as if waiting for someone else to restore the order he believed should already exist. "We cannot delay the session for this," he said, his voice firmer now, trying to reclaim authority. Danielle did not respond. She remained calm, her posture relaxed but steady, her presence alone continuing to pull the attention of everyone in the courtroom. Tom hesitated, clearly aware that the situation had already moved beyond routine. Emily Foster remained focused on her screen, her fingers hovering, ready. The attorneys at both tables sat quietly, their earlier conversations completely gone, replaced by watchful silence. Reynolds stepped slightly closer to Danielle, not aggressive, but assertive. "Ma'am, I am asking you one last time to step back and take a seat," he said, the words hanging in the air. Danielle looked at him calmly, her expression unreadable. She did not step back. She did not argue. She simply held her ground, and the silence that followed felt heavier than anything spoken. A spectator in the second row shifted in his seat. Another leaned forward slightly. The tension was no longer subtle. It filled the room. Danielle's calm seemed to contrast sharply with Reynolds's growing impatience, and for a brief moment, Danielle's eyes drifted toward the courtroom. Windows, sunlight filtering faintly through the blinds, and something in her expression softened, as if memory briefly crossed her mind. Years earlier, she had stood outside another courtroom, younger, less certain, waiting while a clerk questioned her presence, asking if she was in the right building, asking if she was there for jury duty, asking if she understood the process. She remembered standing quietly, answering calmly, and walking away afterward determined that one day she would not be questioned about belonging in a place built on justice. The memory passed as quickly as it arrived. Danielle returned her gaze to the present, her composure unchanged. Tom Bradley noticed the stillness, the quiet resolve, and something in his expression shifted again. Emily glanced at the hallway behind the bench, then back at Danielle, her posture now alert, as if anticipating movement. Reynolds exhaled sharply, clearly frustrated by the silence. "This is not complicated," he muttered, but the words sounded hollow. Danielle Carter stood at the front of the courtroom, calm and unwavering, and slowly, without anyone announcing it, the power in the room continued to move, not with noise, not with confrontation, but with quiet certainty that something irreversible was about to happen. Officer Mark Reynolds glanced again toward the closed door behind the bench, his patience wearing thin as the silence stretched longer than he expected. The courtroom felt suspended, as if time itself had slowed. Danielle Carter remained still, her calm presence now the center of the room. Tom Bradley shifted slightly, his eyes moving between Danielle and the hallway. Emily Foster sat upright behind the desk, her fingers poised near the keyboard, ready for a signal that had not yet come. The attorneys exchanged brief looks. Sensing the tension deepen, Reynolds cleared his throat, trying once more to assert control. "We are starting in less than 60 seconds, he said, his tone firm but edged with uncertainty. Danielle did not respond immediately. Instead, she lifted her gaze toward the empty judge's chair, her expression composed, as if the moment unfolding was exactly as expected. The clock ticked again, the faint sound echoing through the courtroom. A spectator in the back shifted quietly. Another leaned forward, everyone watching, waiting. Then Danielle Carter took one small step closer to the bench, not hurried, not hesitant, just deliberate. The movement drew every eye in the room. Tom noticed first his posture, straightening slightly. Emily followed, her attention sharp. Reynolds frowned, confusion growing. "Ma'am," he began, but the word faded as Danielle placed her documents neatly on the bench, her movements controlled, respectful, the kind of motion that suggested familiarity rather than uncertainty. Tom exhaled slowly, understanding beginning to form. Emily glanced once more at the docket, then toward the hallway, her anticipation now unmistakable. The room felt still again, heavier, the faint hum of the lights seemed louder. Reynolds stepped half a pace forward, uncertain whether to stop her or wait. But before he spoke again, the door behind the bench clicked softly, the sound barely audible, but instantly commanding attention. Every head turned. Tom straightened fully. Emily's fingers hovered above the keyboard. The attorney sat upright. The spectators leaned forward. Danielle Carter did not turn immediately. She remained calm, her posture steady. The door opened slowly, revealing a figure in a dark suit stepping inside. The individual paused briefly, scanning the room, then looked directly toward Danielle Carter. Tom's expression shifted completely, respect replacing uncertainty. Emily sat ready, prepared for the next moment. The figure nodded once, subtle but clear. Danielle finally turned slightly, her composure unchanged, and without raising her voice, without urgency, she reached toward the bench as the room collectively held its breath. The balance of authority that had slowly shifted now reached its tipping point, and everyone in the courtroom understood that whatever came next would redefine the moment they had all just witnessed. The figure who entered from the door behind the bench stepped forward with measured confidence, the polished floor reflecting faint light beneath his shoes. He stopped beside the clerk's desk and leaned slightly toward Emily Foster. She nodded immediately, her fingers already moving across the keyboard. Tom Bradley straightened fully, his posture now formal. Officer Mark Reynolds watched the exchange, confusion turning into unease. Danielle Carter remained calm, her hands resting lightly near the bench. The figure in the dark suit then spoke quietly but clearly. "Court is ready, Your Honor." The words settled into the room like a sudden shift in gravity. Emily stopped typing. Tom's shoulders squared, and several attorneys sat upright at once. The spectators in the back rows exchanged quick glances, the meaning of the phrase landing slowly but unmistakably. Officer Reynolds blinked, his gaze moving from the figure to Danielle Carter, then back again, as if trying to reconcile what he had just heard. Danielle did not react with surprise. She simply gathered her documents, her movements composed and deliberate. She stepped around the side of the bench, her heels making a soft, steady sound against the wood. Tom stepped slightly aside to clear the path. Emily's attention remained fixed on her screen. Ready, the courtroom fell into complete silence. Danielle reached the judge's chair and paused briefly, her hand resting lightly on the back of it, her expression calm. Then she took her seat, the motion smooth and unhurried. The authority in the room shifted instantly. Unmistakably, Emily spoke clearly, her voice formal now. "All rise." The command echoed across the courtroom. Chairs moved quietly as everyone stood, attorneys, spectators, even Officer Mark Reynolds, who hesitated half a second before straightening. The sound of movement faded into silence again. Danielle Carter looked across the room, her expression composed, steady. The figure who had entered earlier stepped back respectfully. Tom Bradley stood at attention. Emily prepared the docket. The courtroom that moments earlier had been filled with uncertainty now settled into formal order. Danielle glanced briefly toward Officer Reynolds, her gaze calm but direct, the weight of the moment unmistakable. The clock above the bench ticked once more, and in that quiet second, the realization spread across the room. Danielle Carter had not stepped forward by mistake. She had taken her place, and the authority that had once questioned her presence now stood silently beneath it. The courtroom remained standing as Danielle Carter settled into the judge's chair, the silence now deeper, heavier, as if the entire room was adjusting to a reality that had shifted in seconds. Emily Foster glanced toward Danielle, waiting for the signal. Danielle gave a slight nod, calm and composed. Emily spoke clearly. "You may be seated." Chairs moved softly across the courtroom floor, the sound subdued, respectful. The attorneys lowered themselves into their seats. Spectators followed. Tom Bradley remained standing near the side, posture formal. Officer Mark Reynolds sat slowly, his expression tightened, uncertainty now replaced by quiet realization. Danielle placed her documents neatly on the bench, her hands resting calmly. She scanned the room once, her gaze measured, professional. The authority she carried now undeniable. She spoke for the first time from the bench, her voice steady and even. "We will begin shortly." The words were simple, but they filled the room with clarity. Emily adjusted the docket. The attorneys prepared their notes. The routine of court resumed, yet the tension lingered beneath the surface. Danielle's eyes moved briefly toward Officer Reynolds. Not confrontational, not harsh, simply observant. Reynolds shifted slightly in his seat, his posture rigid. Tom Bradley noticed and remained still. Emily began organizing the schedule, her movements precise. The figure who had entered earlier stood quietly near the side, watching. Danielle flipped the first page of her documents, her expression calm, composed. The quiet professionalism contrasted sharply with the earlier uncertainty. A lawyer at the defense table cleared his throat softly, readying himself. Danielle paused briefly, then spoke again. "Before we proceed." Her tone remained measured. The room stilled once more. Emily looked up. Tom straightened slightly. Danielle's gaze moved calmly across the courtroom, then rested briefly near the front rows, her expression thoughtful, composed. The silence that followed was not tense now. It was attentive, everyone listening. Danielle continued. "This courtroom operates on respect and order." Her words were calm but firm, the message clear without needing emphasis. Officer Reynolds lowered his gaze slightly. Tom remained steady. Emily prepared to continue. Danielle nodded once more, signaling the session forward. The routine resumed. Yet the shift remained unmistakable. The courtroom that had once questioned her presence now moved under her authority, and Danielle Carter sat calmly at the bench, her composure unchanged, the quiet power of the moment settling into the room as the proceedings began. The courtroom moved forward with quiet efficiency, papers shifting softly, attorneys preparing their opening statements, the rhythm of legal procedures settling into place. Yet beneath the routine, the weight of what had just happened lingered in the air. Danielle Carter reviewed the docket with calm focus, her expression composed, professional, her voice steady as she called the first case. The attorneys approached the podium, their tone respectful, measured. The proceedings unfolded smoothly. But Danielle's presence remained the quiet center of the room, every movement deliberate, every word controlled. Officer Mark Reynolds sat near the side, his posture rigid, his earlier confidence replaced by quiet reflection. Tom Bradley maintained his position near the wall, attentive, composed. Emily Foster continued her work with precise efficiency, the courtroom functioning now with a renewed sense of order. Danielle listened carefully as arguments were presented, occasionally making notes. Her attention sharp, her demeanor calm. After several minutes, she paused briefly, her eyes lifting from the documents. The room stilled once more. She spoke evenly. "Court will take a brief recess." Her voice carried authority without force. Emily nodded, preparing the schedule. Chairs shifted quietly as attorneys stepped back. Spectators whispered softly. The atmosphere relaxed slightly, but the significance of the moment remained. Danielle rose from the bench, her movements smooth, controlled. Tom stepped forward respectfully. The figure who had entered earlier remained near the side, observing quietly. Officer Reynolds remained seated for a moment longer before standing slowly, his gaze lowered. Danielle paused briefly before stepping toward the back door. Then she turned slightly, her eyes moving across the courtroom once more, her expression calm but thoughtful. She spoke quietly, yet clearly enough for those nearest to hear. "Respect defines this room." The words were simple, but they carried weight. Tom nodded slightly. Emily glanced up. The attorneys fell silent again. Danielle gave a small nod and stepped through the door behind the bench. The courtroom remained still for a moment after she left, as if absorbing the message. Then the quiet murmur returned, softer now, more reflective. Officer Reynolds adjusted his posture, his earlier certainty replaced with understanding. Tom Bradley remained composed. Emily prepared the next session. The courtroom that had once questioned Danielle Carter's presence now moved, with quiet respect shaped by her authority. And as the clock ticked forward, the lesson settled into the room. Danielle Carter had not raised her voice. She had not argued. She had simply taken her place. And in doing so, she had transformed the room without a single moment of chaos. Only calm, only dignity, only quiet power.